It's hard to believe that something so tiny could destroy so many.
In just 2 years, this terrible plague was to claim over 20 million lives.
And today, we're counting down our picks for the top 10 worst epidemics in history.
As for adults, those born before 1957 probably got the measles because there was no vaccine back then.
For this list, we're looking at plagues, pandemics, and other scourges of disease that spread through the human population like wildfire, killing millions.
The disease permanently scarred both his body and his mind.
We're not necessarily ranking them based on how many people were killed by the plagues, but those figures definitely play into our choices.
There were areas where outbreaks had occurred where the rat flea was not there to transmit, but nevertheless they had a bubonic plague outbreak.
Number 10, the third cholera pandemic.
By morning, my father was very sick. He had diarrhea that looked like gray water and poured out of him.
The unlucky victims of this disease suffered through hellish final days, with diarrhea, vomiting, and resulting dehydration being the main symptoms.
This is the emergency area where the patient first comes if the patient has severe dehydration. Severe dehydration is a medical emergency.
With the most deaths of any 19th century epidemic, the third cholera pandemic began in India and spread across Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa to countries like Russia, where over 1 million people died.
So in a matter of days, you might have 10 people infected, then 100 people, then 500 people. 1 person in 5 will get severe diarrhea. Without quick treatment, up to half of those people might die.
However, it took an outbreak of this severity for the cause of cholera to be found. In 1854, British doctor John Snow discovered that tainted water was to blame, and it was this breakthrough that eventually allowed officials to get control of the cholera pandemic.
First, we made the water safe. We filtered it through cloth and boiled it for 1 minute.
Number 9, the Asian flu pandemic of 1957.
We all missed it. The military missed it, and the World Health Organization missed it.
Though it can be confirmed that this outbreak of the influenza A virus started in China, the exact origins of the virus are contested, with one popular theory suggesting that a mutation in wild ducks joined together with a typical human strain to create the new disease. One of 3 flu pandemics during the 20th century, this one was the least deadly, with estimated global death figures ranging between 1 and 4 million. And that's likely due to the fact that a vaccine was created in 1957 that helped stem the rash of infections from this avian flu.
We had 40 million doses of vaccine by the time that the end of the year came.
Number 8, the World War I typhus epidemic.
Food was growing ever more scarce. The queues outside the bread shops stretched right down the length of the street.
Taking place during a time of incredible strife, this typhus outbreak was another devastating result of World War I, a disease caused by bacteria, whose symptoms include severe back pain and delirium. This particular outbreak originated with lice.
The perfect setup for epidemic. And then it struck. Typhus.
It was for this reason that delousing stations for the soldiers had been set up on the Western Front, which helped keep those troops healthy.
Next, the 40,000 Italians dwelling in the jam-packed air raid shelters were deloused.
However, the Eastern Front was not so lucky. By the time of its peak, between 25 and 30 million cases were reported across Soviet regions, with 3 million Russians and even more Poles and Romanians dying from infection.
In over 3 brutal years, 2,300,000 Russians had died. A further 5 million injured.
Number 7, Kokolitzli.
The Aztecs' crowning achievement was a gleaming capital city that astonished European explorers called the Venice of the New World.
This disease is categorized in a group of ailments called viral hemorrhagic fever, a family of illnesses that continues to attack humanity with viruses like Ebola.
It is in Monrovia's slums that Ebola is spreading fastest.
Affecting the Aztecs living in the region that would become Mexico twice in less than half a century. Coco Litzli decimated the population, infecting a group that was already reeling from other diseases brought to their shores by Spanish conquerors, and causing their numbers to dwindle by millions in less than a century. With symptoms that included a black tongue, dysentery, severe abdominal pain, and bleeding from your nose, eyes, and mouth. This Ebola-like epidemic annihilated what was once a thriving civilization.
The Aztec Empire had vanished, and with it, a legacy of astonishing engineering achievements.
Number 6. The Plague of Justinian.
This turns out to have been one of the most virulent pandemics in history.
A forebearer of a pandemic that will be featured later on this list. This plague is believed to have been brought to the Byzantine Empire and Constantinople specifically by infected rats traveling from Egypt on grain boats.
Some citizens blamed the plague on the Empress Theodora, saying it was a punishment from God for her sexual promiscuity.
An event that likely changed the course of European and Christian history. The plague of Justinian left the Byzantine Empire short of healthy citizens who could act as laborers or militaries, meaning the empire was severely weakened.
Symptoms would begin with a sudden fever, followed by chills, vomiting, and an increased sensitivity to light.
With some suggesting that at its peak, the mortality rate of this plague took 5,000 lives each day. The first wave of this disease eradicated 40% of Constantinople's population and continued to kill through several more waves in the years that followed.
If the future looked bleak for Europe before, now it looked pitch black.
Number 5. The Antonine Plague. The earliest pandemic on this list. This scourge came to the Roman Empire by way of soldiers returning from fighting in Western Asia. However, what form it took is up for debate, with some thinking smallpox or measles were to blame.
Symptoms start out with coughing, runny nose, and a high fever of 104 degrees. The rash appears 3 to 5 days later.
Though it wasn't as deadly as Justinian, with only 2,000 dying in Rome per day at its pinnacle, and likely 5 million succumbing to the disease in total. The fact that it most probably claimed the lives of 2 Roman emperors, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, served to plunge the land into fear and chaos, and likely changed the course of history.
And the emperor reaps the rewards.
Number 4. The Third Plague Pandemic.
Every rat captured was examined for signs of disease. Anyone who brought in a rat, dead or alive, was paid 10 cents.
The third recorded iteration of the bubonic plague, after the plague of Justinian and the Black Death. This plague ravaged the world for over a century.
In 1900, San Francisco suffered a brief outbreak of plague brought in by rats on a boat from the Far East. Plague was now lurking in the sewers beneath the city.
Beginning with diseased rodents in China's Yunnan province in the 1850s and spreading to all populated areas of the globe thanks to the world's newly established interconnection, this pandemic killed 12 million. And that was just in China and India.
The bacillus spread quickly as it moved along trade routes in the blood of infected rats. With it came the plague.
Finally ending in 1959, when death rates from the disease dropped to roughly 200 according to the World Health Organization, this third plague pandemic allowed doctors and scientists to study the infection and test new treatments. Fortunately, that helped stave off another coming of the plague.
By the middle of the 20th century, the Black Death had been named and tamed. Plague could be treated with antibiotics. Rats could be exterminated.
Number 3. HIV/AIDS.
Over 50,000 men, women and children now carry the AIDS virus. That in 3 years, nearly 2,000 of us will be dead.
Theorized to have spread from primates to humans sometime in the 20th century, there was a case of an HIV-infected human in the Congo in 1959. But it wasn't until the early 1980s that the disease was detected and named in the United States. And the epidemic known as AIDS truly began to spread and define the subsequent decade.
Out there swimming, playing tennis, buffed, coming in, and we're dying. I mean, we're dead 10 days later.
Despite early ignorance that the disease was exclusive to homosexual males and intravenous drug users, AIDS attacked those who didn't take precautions indiscriminately and without mercy.
A positive diagnosis is still a life-altering experience. In Cambodia, people living with HIV are often disowned by friends, family, and the community where they live. This humiliation can be unbearable.
Fortunately, after over 30 years and over 36 million deaths, scientists have been making headway in terms of treatments and possible vaccines, although sub-Saharan Africa is still badly affected.
In Africa, there's a much higher prevalence of HIV, so your probability of it being exposed to someone who's infected is much greater.
Number 2, the 1918 flu pandemic.
It was the worst epidemic this country has ever known.
Various strains of the influenza virus have wreaked havoc on the world again and again. But there are two things that ensured this outbreak's inclusion. It afflicted 500 million people, killing between 50 and 100 million, and it mainly killed healthy adults.
Influenza gave you such high fever. Mother told me that I thought her black hair was a cat. And I was afraid of it with the delirium from the high fever.
Most flu viruses are dangerous for the very young, the very old, and the already weakened. But this strain of the H1N1 virus caused the immune systems of its victims to jump into overdrive and attack. And the healthier the immune system, the more violent the result.
And within a matter of months, as many as 50 million would be dead.
Affecting countries across the globe, as isolated as the Pacific Islands or the Arctic. The outbreak, nicknamed the Spanish flu, has been labeled one of history's worst natural disasters.
We still know much less than we'd like about influenza, but the experiences of the individuals who endured the pandemic of 1918 and the research into that pandemic continue to contribute to our understanding of the disease.
Before we reveal our top pick, here is an honorable, or in this case, dishonorable, mention.
The United Nations-based agency raised its pandemic flu alert to phase 6 on a 6-point scale, indicating the first flu pandemic since 1968 is underway.
Number 1, the Black Death.
Few who caught the disease ever recovered. So rapidly did it spread that it seemed one man could infect the whole world.
Peaking in the 14th century but affecting Europe until the 17th, the Black Death is thought to have killed between 75 and 200 million people, which represented roughly 30 to 60% of Europe's entire population at the time.
In just 2 years, it had swept across Western Europe, spread north over to England, and then finally to Scandinavia.
Suspected by many to be a version of the bubonic plague that originated in infected rodents. This disease was most easily recognized by the tumors that covered victims' bodies. With so many dying so rapidly, bodies littered the streets as cemeteries were at capacity. While some governments attempted quarantines and some citizens turned to God for aid, there was very little that could be done to stop this infection.
Families were torn apart, villages deserted, business collapsed, states bankrupted by loss of taxes.
That doesn't even touch upon the horror of witnessing your loved one suffering, or the fear that you might be next.
After the Black Death, the plague returned to haunt Europe every few decades until the mid-17th century, though never again with the ferocity of that first.
With our list, what do you think was the worst pandemic in the world's history? These events prove the awesome and destructive power of nature. Welcome to... And today we'll be counting down our picks for the top 10 infamous natural disasters of the last 100 years.
I don't think anybody realized how bad it was until it was over.
Number 10, 1992 Hurricane Andrew. We start our list with a natural disaster that wasn't particularly deadly, but was very expensive for the time. 1992's Hurricane Andrew was a Category 4 hurricane that touched down mainly in the Bahamas, Florida, and Louisiana in late August. With over $40 billion worth of damages resulting from this event, Andrew was the most expensive tropical cyclone to hit the U.S. to that point, until it was overtaken in 2005. Number 9. 2005 Hurricane Katrina. Katrina was a huge story internationally, both for its devastation and for the government's handling of the aftermath. On August 29, 2005, it began ripping apart homes and ultimately left the region underwater. Casualties weren't as massive as other entries on this list, but property damage topped $108 billion. Katrina was the United States' most expensive hurricane ever, and it left New Orleans struggling to get back on its feet. Number 8. 2008 Sichuan earthquake. A magnitude 8 earthquake hit China May 12, 2008, only to be followed by a series of strong aftershocks. The resulting homelessness and loss of life was shocking, but the financial burden was overwhelming. The Chinese government announced it would be spending over $146.5 billion to rebuild after the costliest disaster in the country's history. Number 7. 2008 Cyclone Nargis. On May 2, 2008, just a few days prior to the devastating earthquake in nearby China, Burma was hit by its worst ever natural disaster. Low-lying areas like rice fields offered little protection for residents. Damages of $10 billion were reported, and it has been suggested that casualties were purposefully underestimated to reduce negative political consequences. Number 6. 2011 Japan earthquake and tsunami. Measuring a 9 on the Richter scale, this March 11, 2011 disaster was Japan's strongest earthquake ever, and one of the most powerful to have struck anywhere since 1900. Because the quake's epicenter was off Japan's coast, a violent tsunami followed and destroyed everything in its wake. Perhaps the scariest parts of this calamity were the ensuing meltdowns at the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Damage of the entire event has been estimated at $235 billion, making it the costliest natural disaster ever. Number 5. 1976 Tangshan earthquake. This densely populated Chinese city was shocked in the early morning hours of July 28, 1976, by a huge earthquake followed by a magnitude 7 aftershock just hours later. This was China's second deadliest earthquake after another that occurred in 1556. The Chinese government rejected help in the aftermath and was heavily criticized for ignoring early warnings by seismologists. The official death toll ranges greatly from 242,000 to 655,000. Number 4. 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami. 14 countries were touched by this December 26, 2004 disaster, and the most serious devastation was seen in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. Monster tsunami waves almost 100 feet high ravaged coastal cities following the 9.3 magnitude earthquake. This quake was so strong it caused the entire planet to vibrate, tore people from their families, and caused devastation that lasted years. Number 3. 1970 Bola cyclone. This was the deadliest cyclone in recorded history, and it hit East Pakistan on November 12, 1970. At its peak, sustained winds of 115 miles per hour thrashed the region. However, most people died due to flooding because of the violent storm surge that followed. Entire islands and villages were destroyed, and the government was accused of mishandling the aftermath. Number 2. 2010 Haiti earthquake. The magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck Haiti's most populated area on January 12, 2010. Hundreds of thousands of deaths were caused by the country's poor infrastructure, and despite immense support from across the globe, over 1 million people found themselves homeless in its wake. Number 1. 1931 Central China floods. Coming in at number 1 is the deadliest natural disaster in modern history. When the Yellow, Yangtze, and Huai rivers flooded in 1931, millions of people died due to drowning, famine, and disease. The Yellow River is actually considered the deadliest river in the world since it has flooded over 1,000 times in the past 2 millennia. While the death toll of the 1931 event was tragic, it has been suggested that up to 1/4 of the Chinese population, or roughly 51 million people, were affected in some way by this catastrophe.
The infrastructure wiped out. This was the real deal in terms of epic catastrophes.
And today, we're taking a look at 10 of the worst natural disasters of the 2010s.
The biggest problems are heat stroke and dehydration.
The earthquake has extinguished entire neighborhoods.
Others watch helplessly as their properties are razed to the ground.
For this list, we're
looking at the most devastating and deadly storms, earthquakes, tsunamis, floods, mudslides, heat waves, and other natural phenomena the planet experienced from 2010 to 2019. Let us know in the comments which of these events you'll always remember. Number 10. The 2019 Australian wildfires.
The fires aren't just in one location, they're raging everywhere.
From late 2019 onward, bushfires raged across Australia during the country's dry summer months. Australia regularly sees fires, but the 2019-2020 fire season quickly became the worst fire outbreak in decades.
As the fires head south, the warnings are ominous for a dangerous summer ahead.
A huge drought made the conditions perfect for deadly and damaging fires to start, causing unprecedented destruction. The total bill to repair the damage is expected to be billions of dollars, with thousands of homes and other buildings destroyed, along with over 46 million acres of land.
It's like fireballs in the air that explode.
But all that pales in comparison to the people who lost their lives, with a death toll close to 500, as well as the effect the fires will have had on Australia's famous and endangered wildlife.
Reports that as much as half of the island's koala population has been wiped out.
Number 9. Typhoon Bopha. One of the most powerful tropical storms to ever hit the Philippines, Typhoon Bopha was unusual for a number of reasons. First, it was incredibly close to the equator, where typhoons don't usually form. Second, it headed straight for the island of Mindanao, which does not see such powerful storms very often at all.
It knocked out power in 2 provinces and wrecked hundreds of homes. While the government warned its people to take preventative measures, officials accept that message didn't get through to many people in the more isolated areas.
In spite of this, the Filipino government was able to evacuate hundreds of thousands of people to safety. But Bopha still claimed roughly 1,900 lives. It ravaged the Philippines with wind speeds of 175 miles per hour in December 2012, destroying buildings, leaving thousands more homeless, and causing $1.1 billion of damage.
While some start to rebuild their lives or clean up the few belongings they managed to save, others are just glad to be alive.
Number 8. The 2015 Indian heat wave. Though India is a hot country year-round, the 2015 heat wave became an unprecedented disaster, leading to the deaths of 2,500 people across the nation.
It is too hot. It's even tough to accept that there is so much heat.
The hot temperatures felt across the country were between 110 and 120 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the Sahara Desert.
It's not just the heat during the day that's dangerous, it's the heat at night as well. It doesn't really ebb away at all.
Many of the deaths were caused by sunstroke and dehydration. The reason the heat wave was so lethal was that electricity demand for air conditioning couldn't be met, causing power outages, as well as the fact that many people were forced to continue working.
I'm a cleaner, says this woman. I have to look after my children, get food for the family. I have no option but to work in this heat.
There was no respite from the heat until the late-coming monsoon rain arrived in June. A similar but unrelated heat wave also struck Pakistan that same year, causing a further 1,100 deaths.
My parents are suffering, my kids are suffering, but nobody cares. What can we do? We are already sick of it.
Number 7. Hurricane Maria.
Roofs peeled from buildings, debris flying. Structures collapsing. Up to 30 inches of rain in some areas, engulfing whole neighborhoods.
One of 2017's deadliest storms, Hurricane Maria caused over 3,000 deaths, with most of the destruction hitting Puerto Rico and other parts of the Caribbean, coming just weeks after Hurricane Irma.
Winds up to 160 miles per hour and intense rains already causing flooding, thrashing waters in the neighboring island of Martinique, leaving boats there bobbing violently in the seas.
With 2,975 deaths in Puerto Rico alone, Maria was the deadliest storm to hit the island in over a century. Puerto Rico's recovery was made even harder by federal aid from the U.S. coming slowly, with many relief charities and Puerto Rico's elected officials harshly criticizing the response.
95% of the country is still without electricity, and there are shortages of almost every necessity.
It took a year after Maria for the death toll to be finalized, and with damages of $91 billion, it's one of the most expensive Atlantic hurricanes in history.
There's a lot of love in this room.
Yeah, and it's not coming from him. There's a lot of disrespect coming from him.
The president was disregarding our lives. People were dying.
Number 6, the 2018 Sulawesi earthquake and tsunami.
There is a particular cruelty to this geophysical onslaught.
In 2018, a shallow earthquake on the Indonesian island Sulawesi quickly became the deadliest earthquake of that year, causing more than 4,300 fatalities. The biggest earthquake had a magnitude of 7.5, but it had a few nasty foreshocks, all with magnitudes higher than 5, and some aftershocks as well.
To understand the sheer force that was unleashed, you just have to look at that building up there, because that previously wasn't here, but some 100 meters down in that direction, and it was swept here by the moving soil.
But the earthquake triggered not only a devastating tsunami, but also some fast-moving and dangerous mudslides that were some of the worst in history.
It is not a healthy environment at all, and yet these people are having to go through this because this is a part of the world that does not have the kind of infrastructure that can stand up, let alone to an earthquake, but put a tsunami on top of that. They can't do that, and this is the result of that.
The tsunami itself reached over 20 feet tall at its highest point and destroyed many towns and cities. More than 200,000 people were made disaster refugees, and over 600 remain missing.
Officials say hundreds of people are believed to be trapped in mud after the quake caused the ground to heave up and sink down in some places. People have also been trapped under destroyed homes, hotels, and a shopping mall.
Number 5, Typhoon Haiyan.
This is probably one of the top 12, so the top dozen of all storms ever seen on this planet with a satellite or in person. That's how big this is.
This Category 5 super typhoon hit the Philippines only 11 months after Typhoon Bopha, but also did catastrophic damage to other parts of Asia like Vietnam and Palau.
Haiyan's fury hit land hours earlier than expected, dragging surging waves on shore, leaving death and desperation everywhere.
It was one of the most powerful typhoons in history, with wind speeds reaching 195 miles an hour, and the deadliest, taking more than 6,300 lives, with many reported missing. Enormous storm surges were triggered on many Filipino islands, with lots reaching nearly 20 feet high and causing widespread flooding.
Haiyan brought storm surge as high as trees, leveling towns and villages.
The typhoon even caused a dangerous oil spill, decimating the wildlife population as well. The damage cost almost $3 billion, with millions raised by international relief agencies and charities.
The infrastructure wiped out. This was the real deal in terms of epic catastrophes.
Number 4, the Gorkha earthquake.
We could just hear the scream all over the places, people just trying to run out.
Close to 9,000 people died when a 7.8 magnitude earthquake, followed by many more high-intensity aftershocks, hit Nepal in April 2015. Tremors were also felt in nearby India, but the vast majority of the deaths were in Nepal. Over 20,000 were injured as buildings collapsed and landslides destroyed roads. And not only were 3.5 million people made homeless, but many of Nepal's major monuments and heritage sites were destroyed as well.
In the capital city, Kathmandu, 75% of the buildings have been destroyed, leaving tens of thousands of Nepalese homeless.
Nearby on Mount Everest, a deadly avalanche took 22 lives. The disaster has led more research to be done on the fault line beneath the Himalayas so that future earthquakes can be better understood and prepared for.
And hopefully there will be some big changes during the rebuilding because large earthquakes are still locked up, waiting to happen just a little farther west down that deadly fault line.
Number 3, the 2010 Russian heat wave and wildfires. The entire northern hemisphere, including the US, Canada, Europe, Russia, China, and Japan, was racked by an intense heat wave during an excruciatingly long summer in 2010. But Russia was one of the worst hit, with extreme heat causing in excess of 55,000 deaths in that country alone.
And the resulting wildfires burning around Moscow are still clouding the capital in acrid smog. Surgical masks are now a common sight, as locals and tourists try to protect themselves from the cocktail of toxic particles.
Record-breaking temperatures ravaged major Russian cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, with Volgograd seeing the highest temperatures at 106 degrees Fahrenheit in August.
More than 700 separate fires are raging across the country, covering an area of more than 125,000 hectares.
It's impossible, even for a fireman to put out a blaze like that.
Along with the heat putting many people in the hospital, it also triggered a drought and then wildfires across western Russia.
The blazes spread quickly with little warning, leaving under-resourced fire crews struggling to cope.
The fires cost an additional 54 lives and destroyed 740,000 acres of land. Number 2, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. The strongest recorded earthquake to ever hit Japan was a 9.1 magnitude tremor that began just off the coast of Honshu, close to the city of Sendai in 2011.
The quake was the strongest Japan had seen for 1,000 years, even bigger than the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923. It was so powerful that Japan's coastline moved 8 feet to the east and sank 3 feet down.
Categorized as being violent in intensity, almost 16,000 people lost their lives. In addition to the major quake, there were 2 moderate foreshocks and thousands of aftershocks, many of them with a magnitude over 7, making them all major tremors in their own right.
As the quake rumbled across the country, school children ran in fear. Shocked supermarket shoppers tried to stay on their feet. Airport travelers dodged falling debris.
But the worst was yet to come. The subsequent tsunami struck the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, causing major reactor meltdowns in what became one of the worst nuclear disasters in history.
Seismic event turns into nuclear catastrophe.
Some parts of Japan are still uninhabitable.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications.
Number 1, the Haiti earthquake. One of the most damaging earthquakes in living memory. The 2010 Haiti earthquake led to an outpouring of support and relief from the entire world.
In these difficult hours, America stands united. We stand united with the people of Haiti, who have shown such incredible resilience, and we will help them to recover and to rebuild.
With a magnitude of 7, the quake was shallow and inland, only a short distance away from the country's capital, Port-au-Prince, and many other major settlements. Strong aftershocks followed, and Haiti's already struggling infrastructure was almost entirely destroyed, which made evacuation and relief incredibly difficult.
Shoddy construction in this impoverished nation meant buildings toppled to the ground. A hospital was flattened. Even the presidential palace couldn't withstand the force.
The final death toll isn't known. Conservative estimates put it at roughly 100,000 people, while the highest figures exceed 300,000. Haiti's poverty meant the country was not prepared for a disaster of this scale, leading to a tragedy of unimaginable proportions.
One of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere, left in ruins. And a decade later, many are still haunted by the tragedy.